Okay, everybody, welcome to your first lecture. The first e-lecture over what is going to be a series of lectures that you're going to get in this format. This lecture is very much an introductory lecture, and it's meant to kind of set the stage for what's to come. A lot of the examples I use in this lecture are going to be topics that we're going to explore in the future. What we're first of all going to cover is what is science. We're going to talk a little bit behind what goes behind science and why the term has been really torn apart by a lot of different political groups. We're going to talk about the term conservation, what it means to engage in conservation, and finally we're going to talk about resources, more importantly natural resources. So we're going to start by talking about science and what science exactly is. Science, you have to remember, is not this whole thing that's based on fact. Lots of people think that when you use the word science, it has this ultimate authority attached to it, and whatever goes on in science is fact and cannot be changed. That's as far from the truth as you can possibly get. What you have to think about with science is that it's basically a philosophical set of ideas. And if you were to break down science, you would probably be a lot less intimidated by it, by those people in this course right now who are a little bit intimidated by the fact that this is a science course. Science wants to be based on empiricism. Empiricism means that you need empirical data or real observable phenomena. Now, anyone who's in the sciences, or if you start thinking about a lot of sciences, would know that that's not always true, but ultimately that's what scientists try to achieve, is to have real observable phenomena. To say, this is my theory and this is what I'm able to observe. Science is also based on uniformitarianism. This lies a lot with people in geomorphology, people in geology, evolutionary biology, and what they will use in their theory is something called uniformitarianism. That says the key to the past lies in the present. An example of that would say, well, if we're looking at these past geologic deposits of coal, what we can see in the present time is the same situation going on in these swamps and these river delta areas. You can also say the key to the present lies in the past. So you can look at what we have in river valleys, and those same river valleys flowed like that in the past as they do today. Science often goes off track with missing the principle of parsimony. Parsimony is saying the simplest solution to a problem. Oftentimes with science, the individual or group of people will get carried away. The best example I can think of this is your conspiracy theory type people. People that will connect the dots to get to a solution that's very, very convoluted, very complicated, instead of just saying, hey, you know what, those clouds in the sky from a jet flying through is just from the water vapor and the jet condensing. And it's no government conspiracy. There's no one putting stuff in the atmosphere and causing it to rain the next day. It's just the simplest solution is always the best solution to an answer. You don't want to make it complicated. And that's ultimately what science tries to achieve in theory. Uncertainty. This also is unfortunate that science doesn't embrace this that much, especially in this day and age with politics so heavily involved with science, is that science is meant to change with changing evidence. Back in the 1800s, people did not think of the way the plates on the earth move in the same way they do today. Back in the 1800s, people thought that the earth didn't have any movements in its plates. And when this guy, Alfred Wegener, proposed that the plates in the earth moved, a lot of people who were established in the scientific community, laughed at him, and they didn't like their ideas being challenged. And that's unfortunate, because a good scientist would say that the knowledge that they put out there changes with changing evidence. Repeatability. Tests and experiments should be repeatable. If I were to drop a ball off of a tower, that ball should fall. If I did it again, the ball should fall. If the ball went up the next time, then maybe my theory that we have this thing called gravity is not really a good theory and I need to revise my experiment. Of course, we know that if I were to drop that ball over and over again, it would drop. Proof is elusive. Absolute proof is rare in science. In science, it's getting into a lot of the topics that we have, especially with climate change, a lot of topics dealing with forestry, is that you're going to see that different scientists will come out with different conclusions, and they'll all profess, or the different political groups will profess, that what they have is absolute proof, but absolute proof is rare in science, and a lot of science is the way it's interpreted. Finally, science has testable questions. You must test these theories in science. You can't be a good writer and just put something out there. You have to come up with a good experiment. That's what science is. And I wanted to bring this up right now at the beginning of the course because as this course progresses and we start looking at some controversial topics, I want you to be aware that science in many ways is subject to critical review, and it doesn't make it bad, it's what makes it good. This is the scientific method. The scientific method is a method attached to that philosophical set of thinking in science, to where you start out in science by identifying a question. Then you come up with a hypothesis. So that's a question that you can test. You could say, if I were to inject this pot with bleach, this plant is going to die. That is a testable hypothesis. And you could set it up where you have as a control a plant that doesn't get bleach. Now, of course, the more samples you have, the better. You're going to collect the data to test that hypothesis. When you get done, you're going to interpret the results of your experiment. Then you put that into a report. Now, oftentimes in the scientific realm or in academia, you would publish that, or you would put that manuscript out for review to get published. If you put that out for review, this is when other scientists will say, hey, you didn't set up your experiment correctly. You need to collect more data. Did you take this into consideration? Did you think of these other people who did this? This is what makes a scientific method distinguished from someone who just engages in nature writing. That would be more of an opinion column. So oftentimes what you'll see is people who are self-proclaimed scientists, when all that they are is good writers and they happen to write really good articles or opinion columns, but what they are putting out there isn't really peer reviewed. It's just their opinion on what's going on. Now, they can have a very informed opinion, but you want to be careful when we are dealing with these conservation issues in terms of what really is science and what is people's opinions. Finally, if people agree with your opinions, or with, not your opinions, with what the data that you collected, those findings are published. Now, sometimes in science you get what's called a paradigm shift. Paradigm shifts are something as related to something like I was talking about before, where before this guy Alfred Wegener came along, everyone thought that mountains were because the earth shriveled up when it cooled, and it was like drying out an apple and the skin gets wrinkly. When Alfred Wegener proposed that, he was laughed out of the geologic community, and that was back in the 1920s. And it wasn't until the 1960s that people really started taking a look at his idea and saying, wow, you know what that guy was saying was true. It's very rare, and it gets into that whole thing with report for peer review, because unfortunately scientists are human, and oftentimes scientists develop big personalities, or the people around them don't want to think that they could be wrong. And so an idea gets put out there, and it's very difficult to take down, not only because of the person not wanting it taken down, but because it's protected by these people in the scientific community who don't want to have that idea challenged. We're seeing that going on right now in the climate change debate. This gets into pseudoscience and faith-based science. A lot of you might have said before, if science is so great, why are there so many opinions when it comes to the same topic? Why are there so many people saying that climate change is occurring, it's not occurring, that we're going to turn into Venus, that nothing's going to happen at all, that the oceans are going to rise, that they're not going to rise? Well, a lot of that gets into not all science is really science. Sometimes science is, like I said before, opinion. And I say this over and over again in this introductory lecture because this is something, when we go into our readings, I want you to really put on take out your detection kit to see what is BS and what is not. What you want to look for, first of all, when you're looking at this stuff, is what are the sources? Right away, I'm going to say Wikipedia is not really a great source. I use Wikipedia to quickly look at things, but if you are writing something or if you're looking at someone's opinion, they're basing everything they have on Wikipedia, that's not good. If someone only has one source or if they have no sources, that's not really good science. You need to take a look at where this information is coming from. Is this getting put out by someone with the proper credentials? Is this someone talking about medical science who doesn't even have any degree in medicine? Who verifies or supports their opinions? Is this just one person out there putting out the idea that contrails are related to a government conspiracy? Or is there some support in other parts of the community to say, yeah, there's some validity to this theory? What is the position of that person? Now, this one can be tricky because sometimes you get rogue scientists who generally are crackpots, and they really are on the fringes of the community, and they always are, and they have a following, but it's often outside of the community. But sometimes you get someone like Alfred Wegener who really is a good scientist, and they came up with an idea based on good science, and it's going to take a while for it to turn around. Later on, what we're going to see is there was a petroleum geologist by the name of M. King Hubert who came up with a theory on when oil production would peak, and in the United States, and he had a strong position in the community, so it was very difficult for him to be put out as a crackpot. This one also relates to something like Wegener, and to where you want to be careful with it. But if someone comes out and says, well, all this talk about climate change is wrong, and I think that it's going to only get really cold in the next 10 years. That really conflicts with a lot of theories out there. So you want to take a look at why are they saying that. And that, once again, these all link. You want to see if that's a balanced and logical argument. Does this argument relate to the data they collected, or are they just putting out information and connecting the dots to where it's convenient? Funding. You want to look at the funding. Now, this one also can be tricky because sometimes some of the best science comes from funding from agencies that you might suspect makes the person influenced. However, you do want to take a look at this. If somebody puts out an article and they say that there's 400 years of oil left in the United States, and that funding comes from the American Petroleum Institute, you might want to say, well, let's take a look at this in a little bit more detail. Likewise, if you see something come out to where it says every single polar bear out there is going to die, and it's funded by the Sierra Club, you might want to take a look at the validity of that, because these agencies oftentimes do influence the way that this writing occurs. It's sad, but it's true. And finally, most importantly, was this publication subject to peer review? Because if it wasn't subject to peer review, what you're dealing with is an opinion piece. Now, there's a lot of great science and nature writing that is the opinion of people who are established in the community who have published a lot. But then you also get some stuff out there that has that's been written by people who have never published anything peer-reviewed, and they're calling themselves scientists. And you just want to be careful. There's nothing wrong with supporting those ideas, but what you want to be careful is that you don't think of what these people are saying as fact. And once again, I say this now because as the semester progresses, you're going to see over and over again these different articles to where this information, this little kit of yours, is going to come out. What is conservation then? Conservation is what you make it. And that's another principle that we want to have in this class, is that everyone thinks of conservation in different ways. Some people might think that by not using a resource it's conserving it. Some people might think that the only way that you can engage in conservation is by using it, otherwise it's wasting it. So conservation is a term that really you are the one to define it. We have to talk about a resource. What is a resource? It's something of value. That's all what a resource is. Your pen can be a resource to you if you need to write something because it's of value at the moment. So what is a natural resource? Well, there's 5 categories of natural resources. You want to take a look at the cultural background of a group when you start looking at a natural resource, because how that natural resource is viewed depends on the cultural background. Getting into something like whales, in the United States we look at whales very differently than someone from Japan or someone from Iceland. They're looking at that whale as something that's pretty yummy, or they want to eat the fat, or they're seen as something that can be hunted. Now, we generally in the United States don't look at whales in that manner. It's just like if you're from an urban environment and you see deer, you might think, wow, that's pretty, I'd like to take a picture of that thing, to where people, including myself, who are from a rural background, are going to say, wow, there goes some food, I'd like to shoot that thing. You could look at this with something like mesquite. With mesquite, out west, ranchers view mesquite as a nuisance. They try to get rid of it. If you're a Navajo from the Navajo culture, you might view mesquite as a source of nutrients, because those mesquite pods provided a lot of nutrients in that group to live off of the land. That gets into view number 2 in terms of how do you view nature. Now, when we look at a natural resource, we are going to look at that natural resource, bringing up mesquite again, as something different than how someone from the Navajo might view that. Where we see the mesquite as something that we want to control, we want to get rid of it so we can put in a different environment for cattle. A different group might say, well, we want to embrace the mesquite and use it to live off of. You can take that with even something like how do we view forests. Someone who lives in a rural environment might view that forest as something to where that provides an economic livelihood, to where someone often from an urban environment might view that forest as a place for them to find solace and take refuge and enjoy the forest for its aesthetic purposes. Social conditions. What are the social conditions at the time? It used to be that lobster was something that only poor people would eat. There was laws written in New England that said that owners could feed their indentured servants only so many lobsters a week, because it was considered a junk food. Now, socially, lobster is a delicacy. Scarcity. Resources become resources, and how they're used depends on how scarce they are. Now, you can have absolute scarcity and you can have relative scarcity. Absolute is when something is absolutely rare. There's certain minerals that are very rare on the earth. If you look at some animal that's about to go extinct, they're absolutely scarce. However, you can have relative scarcity. Relative scarcity can be there's a lot of it, but there might not be any available in that particular geographic location at the time. If you look at something like a peach crop, you could have a frost that destroys the peach crop down south, and peaches now become relatively scarce down there because they're hard to ship, even though up north the peaches didn't come in and they're abundant up there. So it's relative. It depends on how much is available to use. Finally, technological and economic factors. This is one that we're going to visit quite a bit when we start looking at the energy section, energy module, because technology will often make a resource into a resource when it wasn't before, or it might change the way we view that resource. You could look at something like our Great Plains. Before we came up with centrifuge pumps, we weren't even able to farm in the Western Plains. Now in the Western Plains, that's where all of our cattle feedlots are. We'll look at that in the agriculture section. You look at something even like farming in the Great Plains, it wasn't until we had a steel plow that the plains were even farmable. Before that, people looked at that and they said it was this big desert that you couldn't even engage in agriculture because the best soils were in deciduous forests. Also, you want to take a look at economic factors. This gets into when we start talking about energy. Sometimes a resource becomes so rare that it doesn't become economically feasible to use anymore. We look at something like oil later, we'll see that oil really started to get used heavily when whales were nearly hunted to extinction and whale blubber became so expensive that people started using kerosene. Now what we're seeing is potentially oil becoming so expensive that now it could be replaced by something like natural gas or by electricity. And when we get into energy, we'll visit that in a lot more detail. When we look at resources, we want to look at resource types. Resource types, you can have perpetual, which means it's always there. Getting into energy again, we start talking about with energy issues, one of the most coveted is solar energy. Solar energy actually relates to things like wind energy because ultimately wind is a product of sun heating the ground and differences in pressure from those differences in heat. Gravity is something that we could look at, and even something like perpetual motion, which everyone's always trying to achieve. Now, renewable and non-renewable, when you look at these, you want to take a look at these and make sure that you understand that renewable is only renewable if it's used sustainably. Forests are renewable, but only if you utilize them just as fast as you regenerate new ones. If not, it becomes non-renewable. Notice how I have groundwater in both of these. That's because there's groundwater, such as the Ogallala Aquifer out west, that is non-renewable. Why? Because it's no longer recharged at the rate it once was. Fisheries, right now lots of fisheries in the world are suffering because they're being overfished and they're not stocking as fast as we're consuming those fish. Some other ones that you might want to think of is something like soil is one. You could think of it as deer. The deer herd in Wisconsin is definitely renewable. It's managed well. And then non-renewable, minerals and fossil fuels. Both of these are being created as we speak, but they're being created at such a slow pace that within our lifetime, they're not going to be recreated. And so like I said, this is going to be your fossil groundwater. This is when groundwater forms in a different climate and geologic environment than before than what is currently in the present. And finally, potential. This is the same. There's potential resources that we don't even know exist yet because we don't have the technology. We could think of hydrogen as a potential energy resource. Right now the technology isn't there to make it economically feasible to use, but it has potential. Water could be a resource by breaking the hydrogen away from it. So take a look at this question and see if you can answer. Which of the following examples best fits the technological economic factors resource recognition category? If you said B, then you are correct, because Canadian tar sands are a resource as of recent because the cost of oil has gotten high enough and we have the technology now to where we can use those tar sands as a petroleum resource. Which are the best examples of a renewable resource? Well, groundwater in western Kansas and diamonds. We know diamonds a mineral, that's out. Groundwater in western Kansas, that's that western Ogallala aquifer. Helium is associated with natural gas deposits, and red pine plantation, that makes sense because that's a forest resource. So the answer is C. When we look at natural resource management, we want to look at it in terms of being nature-centered or human-centered. And when we look at that, it's basically, do you see resources of inherent value, or do you see them as something that we use to improve the quality of human life? Most of you are going to fall somewhere in between these two categories. This can be expanded further to where when you look at natural resources, you can see them as exploitation, conservation, or preservation. Now, preservation would be people that say resources are there for us to preserve, not to use. Conservation would be a middle ground approach, saying, you know, we want to use resources, but we don't want to use them so fast that they're going to run out before they can regenerate.